So let's begin. Um, and let's begin with a little bit of an overview of the Parsha. So you know what? For those who don't know, Chabad has an online. Well, they have a lot of stuff online, but I just found a paragraph, so I'm going to read it. It's a really short, succinct overview of all the Parsha of Vayishlach. General overview. In this week's reading, Vayishlach, Yaakov returns to Canaan but is fearful of his brother Esav. They meet and make peace. Yaakov wrestles with an angel and his name is changed to Yisrael. Yaakov's daughter Dinah is abducted by the prince of Shechem. Shimon and Levi destroy the city of Shechem and liberate Dinah. Rachel dies while giving birth to Yaakov's 12th son, Binyamin, and Yitzchak dies at the end of the Parsha. And there you have it. The Shiur is over. Thank you for joining me. Hope you have a great week, everybody. No, okay. There's more. There is definitely more. There's a ton more. This is actually, it's an emotional Parsha. And I keep stressing this, but as we read through this and we talk about different Parshanim, I just want to remind you to allow yourselves to sort of encounter the Parsha, meaning this is a story of our great Avot and Imahot. I realize that, but it's also a human drama, and there's a ton of emotion, and there's a ton of things happening here that we need to take a pause and step back and just try to imagine what it's like. So let's just begin, set the stage for the beginning of the Parsha, the reunion between Yaakov and Esau. The last that Yaakov heard, Esav wanted to murder him for what he had done by taking the brachot. And so for 20 years, he hasn't seen his brother, he hasn't seen his mother, he hasn't seen his family. He's lived with Lavan, and he's lived through a lot. He's lived through such deep, deep disappointment, the story of Rachel and Leah. He's lived through the birth of an extraordinary family. He's lived with a father-in-law who has who cheated him 10 times by Yaakov's own admission. And finally, he realized, as God had told him, it's time to leave. He needs to go back to the land of Canaan, and the journey begins. And so he's coming back, he's on his way back, and news has come to him that his brother Esav is approaching. And Esav has an army of 400 armed men. And so you haven't seen Esav for 20 years, and the last you know, he was seeking revenge. He wanted to murder Yaakov. And so Yaakov, of course, doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. He doesn't know the future. But he knows that Esav, at the time, was a person who was furious. And Yaakov gets it because he feels guilty at what had happened. He knows that what he had done. I don't know whether Yaakov consciously was aware that some of the things that happened to him in his own life were the divine payback for what he had done in his life. So, for example, when he wanted to marry Rachel and Lavan switched Rachel with Leah, the language there that Lavan uses to say, you know what, we don't do this in our place, to sort of favor the youngest one over the oldest one. How did Yaakov hear that? When he heard that, do you think it resonated? Well, that's exactly what I did. I was the youngest, and I tried to wrest the brachot from my father, the brachot that were designated for the Bechor. I took them. And maybe he realizes the way Lavan uses that language, is it just language, or is it a sign, a message from God, that somehow this is his divine payback? And it doesn't just happen here. It happens again, of course, when Yosef is taken and he's tricked yet again. So the son that tricks is paid back, which is an interesting thing to consider. And I'm not going to get into it now. But if this was designed to be the way in which his life in Jewish history unfolded, is he therefore exempt from any responsibility that he played in that way in which it unfolded? Clearly, the Torah says maybe not. He had to undergo this payback, even if you say it had to end up being this way. Otherwise, the Jewish people would not be the people we are today. It's an interesting idea. But here at the beginning of our story, Yaakov realizes that the encounter that he's about to have, he really doesn't know how it's going to turn out. So he has a plan, and the plan is to sort of try to mitigate what could be a disaster by doing a few things. And so he sends messengers to greet his brother and his accompanying army. And amongst the things he tells this small group of people, his messengers, he says to them, and I'm going to read now, reading from chapter 32, Pasuk 5, Vayetzav otam lemor, Ko tomrun la'aduni la'esav, Ko amar avdecha Yaakov, Im Lavan garti va'echar ad ata. Then Yaakov sent angels or messengers ahead of him to Esav, his brother, to the land of Seir, the field of Edom, and he charged them, the messengers, saying, Thus shall you say to my lord, to Esav, so said your servant Jacob. Now it's the messenger speaking. I, Yaakov, have sojourned with Lavan and have lingered until now. I have sojourned with Lavan and have lingered until now. I'll say it again in Hebrew. Im Lavan garti va'aichar ad ata. I have sojourned with Lavan. So the words in Hebrew are Im Lavan garti. So Rashi offers a comment which has become, I don't know, one of the most often quoted Rashis. And here's what Rashi says. And it's an interesting idea. He says garti. The word garti, literally in Hebrew, I don't know what it means. Sojourn. Lagur means to, I guess in English, sojourn means to live. I dwelled with Lavan, and I lingered till now. Rashi says the following. And here he quotes a midrash that garti, the word garti, has 4 letters in it: Gimel, Resh, Taf, Yud. In Lavan garti. And Rashi says, well, if you think about those letters, Gimel, Resh, Taf, Yud, if you transpose them, they form an acronym, or really a numeric equivalent. Garti, Gimel, Resh, Taf, Yud, transpose them to Taf, Resh, Yud, Gimel, Taryag. Taryag is a numeric equivalent of the number 613, which obviously is a number that means something to us in the notion of Jewish mitzvot. There are 613 mitzvot, commandments in the Torah. And so Rashi says the following: Im Lavan harasha garti, with the evil Lavan I lived, v'taryag mitzvot shamarti, v'lo lamadati mima'asav hara'im. I lived with Lavan, and yet I fulfilled all 613 mitzvot in the Torah because I did not learn from his evil ways. So let's just unpack this for a few minutes because there's a lot of questions about that. So the obvious question about this explanation, Rashi, by the way, is known as a pashtan, which means he's always seeking the plain meaning of a verse, the plain meaning. And he only resorts to using midrashim when he feels that the midrash, in fact, is the plain meaning of the verse. But how can this midrash even be the plain meaning of the verse? Because from a historical perspective, Yaakov is centuries before the revelation of the Torah at Har Sinai, where Taryag mitzvot were revealed. There were no such things as Taryag mitzvot at the time of Yaakov. So what is the possible meaning behind what the rabbis are saying, and Rashi is quoting, when they put these words into Yaakov's mouth when he speaks to Esav? Esav, I want you to know, I lived with Lavan, but while I was there, I fulfilled all the mitzvot of the Torah. So there's a lot of different parts to this. So let's try and unpack this one by one. How could Yaakov have done all the mitzvot in the Torah? 1, there were no mitzvot in the Torah. And 2, if there were no mitzvot in the Torah, even if there were, nobody can do all the mitzvot in the Torah. None, nobody, ever. It's not possible for any single Jew to fulfill all the mitzvot in the Torah. So to understand this midrash literally, obviously makes no sense. But it wasn't intended to be understood literally, which means then we have now a job to do to dig a little deeper. So number 1, it's often said, the Gemara talks about this, is that our forefathers were great people. They were humans, as we see from some of the stories that are indicating some of their strengths and some of the the behaviors which indicate challenges, weaknesses. But having said that, they were people of extraordinary spiritual insight and intuition, to the point that the Gemara says that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov obviously were never given the commandments of the Torah. That only happens years, centuries later. And yet, from the relationship they had with God and with some sort of spiritual energy and strength and intuition that they possessed, they fulfilled the mitzvot of the Torah. So that would mean that Yaakov is saying, while I was living with Lavan, while I was living in the midst of a culture of a person who was really actively trying, deliberately attempting to steer me away from this, I held my ground. I held my ground and I clung to my ability to fulfill the spiritual understandings, the spiritual expectations that God had of me. I didn't collapse. I didn't surrender. Now, a couple of things. Why do you think Yaakov is saying this message to Esau? Like, what's that about? So I think that, I don't know if you remember the very end of last week's Parsha when Lavan was chasing Yaakov and they finally caught up to each other. And although Lavan was actually intending to harm Yaakov, he was interrupted by God, who said to him, if you touch my Yaakov, you're going to be in trouble. So Lavan backed off and they made a pact. And the sign of the pact was a mound of stones, which Lavan called Yegar Sehaduta, which is the Aramaic version of mound of stones, which were witnesses. Gal Eid was what Yaakov called them. Yegar Sehaduta is the Aramaic name that Lavan gave to it. Gal Eid is the Hebrew name that Yaakov gave to it. What's the deal? As the Sephorno said, Yaakov is refusing. Yaakov is refusing to surrender his language, which somehow is the tool by which we reflect and hang on to our core values. He was refusing to call this by the name that Lavan wanted. He said, no, I'm standing my ground. I don't care. I'm prepared to be who I am and to fight for it. And so that was the end of last week's Parsha. In the beginning of this week's Parsha, we find Yaakov continuing that sort of strength of character and his commitment to his core values and telling Esau, I want you to understand who I was. Because don't forget, Yaakov at the very end might have seemed to Esau to be a weak person. After all, he had to sort of steal the brachot. It wasn't a face-to-face battle. It wasn't combat. It wasn't, I want this and you have to give it to me. But he had to sneak it from his father in a very, critical way, in a way that wasn't honorable, perhaps is the way Esau saw. And Yaakov is saying, I want you to understand something about me. You may have known me as Yaakov, that Yoshev Ohalim. You may have seen me as that guy who really didn't know much about the world. But I want you to understand where I was for 20 years. I was the man who really pushed me to the limit. But I want you to know I stood my ground. I stood my ground. This is what you're dealing with now, Esau. Now, I don't think Yaakov is trying to come in a stride way, but I think he's making a point. But there's something else about this that I want to just unpack with you. If, in fact, it was impossible for any one Jew at any time of history to fulfill all the mitzvot in the Torah, what do you think the Chachamim are trying to tell us about this? That in Lavan Garti, the Taryag mitzvot shamarti. So in its simplest translation of the word shamarti, it would mean I observe. But as one of the commentaries suggests, since it's not likely that this could be interpreted in its literal sense, because it's not factually correct, nobody can observe all 113 mitzvot, then why use the word shamarti? So one of the commentaries points out that the word shamarti in some places in Tanakh actually has another meaning. So, for example, they point to another pasuk, not in this week's parsha, but we'll get to it very shortly. When Yaakov has his, when Yosef has his dreams, coming up in next week's parsha. Do you remember the dreams where Yosef tells his brothers and his father about him standing in the center and everybody bowing down to him? And the Torah tells us the Aviv, this is referring to Yaakov in response to Yosef's dreams, the Aviv shamar et hadavar. The word shamar. Now, what is the word shamar there? It doesn't mean observe and fulfill in the context as it does here. It means he held on to it. He was waiting. He understood there was something about this dream that Yaakov had to keep in mind, had to keep in mind. And that's the content, or that's the context of Shamar that maybe we need to reapply to this comment. So when Yaakov is saying, I fulfill the entire Torah, he doesn't mean I fulfill the entire Torah. Taryag mitzvot shamarti, he means I know where I was. I was in a very difficult situation, and I realized that not everything I wanted to do I could fulfill. But Taryag mitzvot shamarti, I was longing for the day. I was hoping for the day. It was on my mind 24/7. I realized what I could do, and I realized what I couldn't do. And I realized what I couldn't do, it never just left my mind and said, okay, I did the best I can, and I went on. Never had that. I never had that sense of making peace with myself that this is the best version of myself I could be. Taryag mitzvot shamarti means I waited and I anticipated the time that I could be that person that I wanted to be. And what Yaakov, of course, I think is suggesting through this interpretation is that who we are? Are we the type of people who have that sense of anticipation to be the best type of person we can be? Or have we made peace with ourselves? Being in Lavan's presence for 20 years, it would have made, well, it would have been understandable if Yaakov had cut corners and lowered his expectations and said, you know what, it's just too hard. This is just too hard of a life. I can't keep thinking about what I could be. I got to make peace with who I am and what I can do. But he didn't do that. Yaakov always kept this sort of image of what he could be in front of him and longed for it and waited for it and tried to get it. And when the opportunity came, when he was told, now go there, he said, this is my time to act. And I think at some point, all of us have to ask ourselves the question, so what are we? And Gemara says that when after 120 years we get to Olam Haba, there will be a series of questions that Hashem puts to us in terms of assessing our lives in this world, of the time that we had. And one of the questions we're going to be asked is Tzipita leYeshua. Did you anticipate, were you longing for redemption? Meaning, I think, this is what I'm saying, is that what Hashem is asking is, did you make peace with everything? Were you okay the way everything turned out? Or did you realize that there could be more? Were you longing for more? Were you striving for more? Tzipita, were you expecting redemption? Or you say, no, you know what, we're all here. This is where we live, and that's the way it's going to be. And I understand that all of us need to live our lives with some sort of emotional stability and balance. That's correct. But in some place in our spiritual existence, when we think about ourselves and the wholeness of the universe and how we fit into a bigger picture and what our bigger goals should be, to what extent does the picture of what we could be in a bigger world, a different world, play into it? I think for some, of course, that becomes a question about and I'm not making a judgment. So where should we live now? Should we be trying to move to Israel? And I know that there have been those voices that we heard at Sher Shemaim this past week from a very strong and strident person who said, no, you got to be moving. You got to be moving. So I think sometimes it's important for us to hear voices that push us to think in ways that we haven't thought for a while and to stir up our passions a little bit. But I think that's the point here that this commentary is saying when Yaakov Avinu says, at Taryag mitzvot shamarti, he was saying that even in a situation that seemed to be so hostile to my religious values, I anticipated. I didn't give up. I didn't let them slide. I was waiting and waiting for the moment that I could grab onto them. Okay, that's the first idea I wanted to share with everybody. Now, the second. So Yaakov understands that what's about to happen could have devastating consequences. And by I mean devastating, he realized this could be a full-up battle and people are going to die. People are going to die. And so he began to consider strategy. Torah says, Pasuk Chet, Vayira Yaakov Me'od Vayetzir Lo. I'll read it. Jacob became very frightened and it distressed him. Why frightened and distressed? Again, when we talk about biblical interpretation, every word is measured. And when you have the Torah say he was very frightened and distressed, it sounds as though maybe there's synonyms. And so if the Torah is using two separate words to describe his mental state or his feelings, it's usually an indication that it's not just a synonym. It's not just for emphasis, but there's something different each word has. So Vayira Yaakov Moed, he was afraid for what was about to happen. Vayetzer lo, vayachatz et ha'am. He distressed him and he divided the people. So what was his strategy? The strategy was to divide his entourage, whoever was there, in the hope that if God forbid battle erupted, at least some would stay. And so one of the interpretations suggests what really distressed him was that he felt that the strategy that held the greatest promise for his people, the Jewish people, was to divide them, was to cause division, to split them up. And Yaakov may be saying a comment that we don't always appreciate, that our strength lies not in our ability to be divided. Our strength lies in our ability to stand together and as one unit try to fend off the enemies that seek to harm us. But be that as it may, he does make this division. And he says the following, Vayomer, Im yavo Esav el hamachaneh ha'achat v'hikahu v'haya hamachaneh ha'nishar lifleta. For he said, if Esav comes to the one camp and strikes it down, then the remaining camp shall survive. So you can just imagine this. You can just imagine his wives, his children, all the people in his home that he cared for. He realizes that they may die. And so he makes a strategic decision, however he does it, to divide into two. And if a war erupts and he has to engage in a battle, that while he's fighting one camp, the other camp can flee. Like who are the people you're going to save and who are the people that you're not going to save? It's a scary thought. So I just want to share with you something Rav Moshe ben Nachman, the great commentary in the Torah Ramban, says on this pasuk. And I'm going to read it in Hebrew and translate. I find this very powerful. The hakavana bazeh, and the intention in this, says the Ramban, ki Yaakov yodea she'ein zaro kulo nofel biyad Esav. Yaakov realizes that his entire descendants will never fall into the hands of Esav. If so, at least one part of the camp will be saved. And he says, if that's the case, the Ramban says, this story of Yaakov's encounter with Esav, as all the stories in the Chumash, are not just stories about Yaakov's encounter with Esav as two biblical personalities or historical figures who happened to meet on a certain day, and this is how the meeting played out. What this is, says Ramban, and so say the Chachamim, these are stories, these are precursors of the history of the Jewish people. That what happens to Yaakov doesn't happen just to a man called Yaakov, it happens to the nation called Israel. That what you're watching, what we're seeing, is the paradigms that repeat themselves throughout the cycle of Jewish history. And what happened to Yaakov and Esav is in fact a pattern that's established for all Jewish people. And he says, the Gam Zeh Yirmoz, and this story also alludes, Shelo Yigzeru Aleinu B'nei Esav, that the descendants of Esav will not bring upon us these rules, they will not succeed in ever destroying our name. They will not succeed in erasing our name. Avol ya'asu ra'ot im ktsatenu. They will succeed. They will succeed in bringing evil upon a part. B'ktsat ha'aratzot shelahem, in the sum of the lands in which they live. Melech echad mehem gozer ba'artzo al mamono. One king in one land may pass an edict about his possessions, o al gufenu, or about our bodies. Umelech acher merachem bimkomo umatzil hapalatim. And another king in another land may have compassion and take in the refugees. So what the Ramban is saying is Yaakov's decision here is really a decision for the ages, is that the entirety of the Jewish people will never fall into the hands of our enemies, but some will. And just as some will fall, some will be helped. And so the not so happy part of the story is an understanding that what Yaakov was facing is what all of us face. All Jewish history is the same. How do we survive in the face of our enemies who seek to destroy us. There is a strategy, and we employ the best strategies. And even with the best strategies, unfortunately, our history books are filled with losses. But our history books will never, ever record the defeat of the Jewish people, because that is not going to happen. But the Gemara tells us, and Rashi mentions, so what is it that Yaakov did to prepare himself? One strategy, as we talked about, was to divide the camp into two parts. We got that. But there's another strategy, and that strategy is something I just want to mention here. So Rashi quotes that what Yaakov did was to create a three-pronged approach to the potential battle or conflict. And he did three separate things, as the story tells us. I didn't read the whole story, but I'm condensing it. So one of the things that Yaakov did was he sent a series of gifts to Esau. Why? Because sometimes gifts soften people up. Oh my goodness, how, you shouldn't have, but you really like it. And so sometimes gifts do have that impact. And he didn't just give like and here's a pen. The Torah, he sent animals and things that would indicate wealth, or things that indicated just how much you appreciated the other person. And Yaakov, of course, was a wealthy person, and he wanted to make sure that he did whatever he could to avoid conflict. So he sent a very substantial gift to Esau in the hope that that would appease him. But he also got ready for war, because sometimes that is what you have to do. You need to be ready for a multiple approach. So Doron, which was one of the words for gift in Hebrew, Milchama, but he also engaged in yet perhaps the oldest response to suffering or impending tragedy or impending conflict for the Jewish people, and that is tefillah. He prayed. And I just want to pause a little bit here, and I just want to examine this notion of prayer. So what's the origin of prayer? So the origin of prayer, as we see in the Torah, is that at certain points, some of the Avot naturally pray. And they pray out of a need. They pray out of a circumstance. They pray out of a sense of wanting to connect to the Creator. Not because there's a mitzvah. It's not. The biblical origin of prayer, it needs to be clear, is spontaneous prayer. Spontaneous prayer. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, all of our avot, this Tanakh is filled with examples of spontaneous prayer. And yet, you and I know that that's not the way in which we have been educated. And so the Rambam says in Hilchot Tefillah, he talks about the transition of prayer from the spontaneous prayer model, which the Torah tells us, to the fixed prayer model. And the fixed prayer model emerged at the time of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. That takes us back to about the 4th century BCE, following the first exile, in which it became clear that the Jewish people, who no longer were rooted in the land of Israel, began to deal with and suffer from a lack of competence in speaking Hebrew. Because after having been exiled and taken to a diaspora and disconnected from their holy land of Israel, the language that they found themselves having to deal with was a foreign language. And what happened, as the Rambam explains in Hilchot Tefillah, was that after a while, people no longer were able or comfortable in expressing themselves in Hebrew. And remember, prayer was all spontaneous. So spontaneity required you to be able to express yourself. And that was the model. And you didn't have to daven Shacharit, Mincha, Maariv. That came much later. And you didn't have to daven from a siddur. And you didn't have to daven Shemona Esrei. All you daven is what was on your mind and your heart. And that's what you had to do. And only later in the Torah, when the Torah establishes what seems to be this notion of tefillah, the Torah never established you have to daven Shacharit, Mincha, Maariv. And the Torah never established that you have to daven any specific prayers. And the Torah never established at what time of the day you needed to daven. And the Torah never established how much you had to pray or what you had to pray. The only thing that really is connected to a biblical commandment of Torah, a big biblical commandment of prayer, not from our Parsha, but later on in Chumash, was that you had to daven once a day. How long? It's up to you. What do you say? It's up to you. What language? It's up to you. But when the Jews historically were taken out of their country, the ability for them to have that moment of prayer in a natural and fluent, expressive manner got more and more difficult until the rabbi said, okay, we need to create structure that helps them with their expression. And so was born structured prayer, so was born Siddur, so was born Shacharit, Mincha, and Mariv. Okay, now let's just take another step further. Is there a mitzvah to daven at a specific time? The general mitzvah of tefillah, as I said, the answer to that is no, except for one exception, and this comes not in our Chumash, later on in Sefer Bimidbar, as well as mentioned in Barim, at a time of what's called Eit Tzara. If we find ourselves in a time of real dire emergency, the Torah says at that point, you are obligated by biblical law to pray. It's not what you have to pray, but to pray. When everything seems to be teetering on, God forbid, a worse tragedy, we're asked to strengthen our faith in God and turn to God in prayer. And that in Hebrew is called an Eit Tzara. There is a fascinating machloket between two of the great minds and great philosophers and jurists of Jewish law of all the ages, one of whom I've mentioned already tonight. His name is Rav Moshe ben Nachman, and the other is Rav Moshe ben Maimon. And Rav Moshe ben Nachman was definitely aware of the writings and the greatness of Rav Moshe ben Maimon. But two of them, at least when you looked at what they had to say, seemed to be at odds with each other and disagreed with each other when it came to the issue of tefillah. Rav Moshe ben Maimon was of the opinion that there really isn't a mitzvah of prayer that applies. Let me start another. Just make sure that I say this correctly. Rav Moshe ben Nachman, start with that, believed that if there is a point of danger, like an enemy forces that are gathering outside of the city walls, it looks like there's going to be a war, there's going to be then it's time to daven. It's time to pray. Everybody get together. We're going to daven. It's a mitzvah. Rambam had a different idea, and he said there's a mitzvah to pray every day. There's a mitzvah to pray every day. So Rav Moshe ben Nachman said, no, only when there's an identified danger. Rav Moshe ben Maimon, in his writings, Hilchot Tefillah, said, no, there's a mitzvah to pray every day. So when you take a look at it, it looks like these two are obviously disagreeing with each other. Rav Yosef Dov Levi Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, otherwise often called the Rav, the former Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University, prolific writer, but also an existential philosopher. And you see this so much in his writing, but one of the places where this actually becomes really clear is in a few articles that he's written, a few places where he specifically addresses the question of prayer. And I'm reading from a book called The Reflections of the Rav, compiled by one of his students, and in an essay called Prayer as Dialogue, Rav Soloveitchik makes a fascinating distinction, and he tries to suggest that really there is no disagreement between Rav Moshe ben Maimon and Rav Moshe ben Nachman. That even though Rav Moshe ben Nachman says there's only one time to pray biblically, and that is Eit Tzara, and the Rambam says there's a mitzvah to pray every day, so it sounds like they're not agreeing. But the Rav says no, they're not disagreeing. They agree. How could they agree? And the Rav says because Rav Moshe ben Maimon believed that every day is an Eit Tzara. That every day poses, in some ways, existential crisis. And I would think that maybe our generation understand that perhaps better than other generations, certainly post October the 7th, where there's so many so many news posts and headlines and things happening around the world that probably, Michelle and I often talk about this. We feel so much more unsettled than we ever remember feeling. But the Rav would say that exact feeling of being unsettled, of having some existential concern about what the future will hold, that is precisely what Rav Moshe ben Maimon meant when he said, I agree with the Rambam that we have to daven in an Eight Sarah. But in my mind, says the Rambam, according to Rav Soloveitchik, every day suggests an Eight Sarah because there's so many questions that we just have no answers to. We don't know what the future is going to be. We don't know what the rest of the day or the week is going to be. So it's a difficult type of life to feel so unsettled that you think your whole life is an Eight Sarah. But what happens here is Yaakov Avinu feels the Eight Sarah. He understands it, and he engages in tefillah because this really is an Eight Sarah. The troops are approaching. But for the Rambam, of course you daven when the troops are approaching. That's for sure. But he believes, Rav Soloveitchik, that a sensitive and critical thinking Jew will realize in some ways every day can pose some of those anxieties. And those anxieties are the reason for which prayer on a daily basis makes sense. Okay, that's Dvar Torah. Let's go a little bit further. The moment of meeting is coming upon them, and it's the night before. So I'm going to just, you know the story, and I'm just going to read part of it with you. I'm reading Perek Lamed Beit, chapter 32, and I'm going to start it. I'll start at Pasuk 23. So just for the purposes of time, I'm going to read it in English, and I'm reading from the Stone Translation Interpretation. But he got up, talking about Yaakov, but he got up that night and took his 2 wives, his 2 handmaids, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Yabok. And when he took them and had them cross over the stream, he sent over his possessions. So there's some sort of stream here. He takes his family and he crosses over the stream. And Yaakov was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. When he perceived that he could not overcome him, he struck the socket of his hip. So Yaakov's hip socket was dislocated, and he wrestled with him. And then he said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." And he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What's your name?" He replied, "Yaakov." And he said, "No longer will it be said that your name is Yaakov, but Yisrael, for you have striven with the divine and with man and have overcome." Then Jacob inquired, and he said, "Divulge, if you please, your name." And he said, "Why then do you inquire of my name?" And he blessed him there. So Yaakov called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen the divine face to face, yet my life was spared. The sun rose for him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping on his hip. Therefore, the children of Israel are not to eat the displaced sinew on the hip socket to this day, because he struck Yaakov's hip socket on the displaced sinew. Wow. So you have a sense that this encounter with the man is not an encounter with a human being. It's clearly not. It's an encounter with an angel. And we read this story, and we try to make sense of it. We try to figure out what's this about. And again, every time we read these stories, say, what's this about? What's it about for Yaakov? But what is it about for me? Like, where am I in the story? And why does Hashem decide that this story should be read every single year and should be studied and should be explicated and expounded? Because something in the story, or many things in the story, are worth thinking about. So I want to share with you a really fascinating interpretation by Rabbi Yosef Salant. Uh, he was a Rav in Yerushalayim, I believe in the early 1900s, and he wrote a series of essays, commentary called the Be'er Yosef. And in his commentary called the Be'er Yosef, he offers a really interesting understanding. So just to sort of create the framework by which I want to share his explanation. So what do we know about the story? So Yaakov is having a fight, a wrestling match with an angel, and the angel and he are trying. He wants the angel to give him a blessing. The angel says, "Let me go, let me go." The angel finally hits him in his hip socket, and which in Hebrew is called the Gid Hanasheh. And as a result of that, the Chumash says Jews are not allowed to eat the Gid Hanasheh, and that's why we're not allowed to. That's an unkosher part of the animal. And his name was changed to Israel because you have striven with divine and man, and you have conquered. You have persevered. Okay, so I want to share with you a really interesting discussion, which sounds like a very dry discussion of halacha, but Rabbi Yosef Salant tries to peel back a layer from this discussion, this disagreement, and help us understand what's at the core of this story. What's it really about? Okay, so here's I'll tell you, I'm going to read a little bit of the Gemara. I'll say it in English. It's in Masechet Chulin, which is the Gemara which essentially talks a lot about the laws of kashrut. And it tells us that there's a machloket, a disagreement between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. What's the argument about? The argument is, well, every animal has two hind parts. Each part has a sinew, the Gid Hanasheh, on the right side and on the left side. So we see a connection. The angel hit Yaakov on his hip socket, and therefore, from that point on till today, Jews don't eat that part of an animal. Okay, but which part is that? So Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim have a disagreement. According to the Chachamim say, well, you're not allowed to eat the sinew on the right side and on the left side, because every animal has two sides to it. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, I think the only part you're not allowed to eat is on the right side, not on the left side. What's the reason? Well, the Chachamim say that when the angel and Yaakov were fighting, the angel, as it were, pushed and hit Yaakov from behind, which affected equally his right side and his left side. But Rabbi Yehuda says no, that the angel hit Yaakov only on the right side. And that's why only the sinew, the Gid Hanasheh, on the right side is what is asur. So you're listening to this machlok and saying, like, what does it actually matter? Like, what's going on here? And what is it that would be evidence, perhaps, in the story? And why then is the story, what is the story trying to tell us about this? Is it just a question of a dry kashrut law, or could there be something a little bit more behind it? So here's how Rabbi Yosef Salant helps us sort of see this. Says, when you take a look at the nature of the Torah, generally speaking, we divide all the mitzvot, all the 613 mitzvot that we spoke about before, into two categories. And it's also true even for the Aseret HaDibrot. If you take a look at the picture of the Aseret HaDibrot, no matter what sort of graphic image you're seeing, whether it's our shul or your shul or any other picture. So we have a picture of the Aseret HaDibrot, which would be a great example of what I'm saying. There's the right side, and there's the left side. So right away from the very graphic or picture in our mind, we already have the Torah divided into a right side and a left side. And it's hard not to understand right and left I mean, this is what this machloket between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yochanan is about this. Right, left. So what's the right side and what's the left side? So if you take a look at the Aseret HaDibrot, what's on the right side? The right side of the first five Aseret HaDibrot, and they generally are described as mitzvot bein Adam lamakom. These are the mitzvot that govern the interaction of how man interacts with God. Bein Adam lamakom. And what about the left side? The left side are different. These are the laws that govern the interaction of man between man. Bein Adam lachaviro. Murder and theft and adultery and false testimony and coveting. Yeah, great. Whereas on the right side, of course, belief in God, idolatry, Shabbat, and the one that has some sort of question related to it is respecting your parents, honoring your mother and father. But the Gemara says because honoring your mother and father is really in some ways honoring God because they're very similar. And so those first five on the right, being Adam Makom, and those on the left are being Adam Lachavero. And so take that distinction of right and left and bring it back to the story. So when you take a look, when you think of a person, you think of a person walking in a straight line, walking in a balanced way with right and left, which means what? That in our life, in our conduct as Jews who believe, we walk in a straight line, emphasizing the importance of those mitzvot, which are bein Adam l'makom on the right side, and bein Adam l'chavero on the left side. But if there's an injury on one side, so if you have an injury on your right side, that's an injury, a smack to bein Adam l'makom, which means it's your bein Adam l'chavero side, which remains firm. And the opposite would be true, that if somehow you were given a big punch that damaged your left side, which is bein Adam l'chavero side, then it'd be your right side, your bein Adam l'makom side, which remains strong. You'd be limping, but one side is stronger than the other. And think about that in the course of our lives, or the course of the life of the Jewish people. There have been times, haven't there, when one side seems stronger than the other. There have been times where the side of bein Adam l'chavero, those laws which govern the way in which we treat each other, the ethical laws, the laws of social intercourse, the laws of justice, the laws of all of those things, they seem stronger, whereas the laws that sometimes govern the way in which we relate to God. So Rabbi Yehuda says, bein Adam l'chavero, those are the laws. If Yaakov got hit on the right side, what remained strong was bein Adam l'chavero, and that side can sometimes be enough to bring you back. Do you remember the story in Masechet Shabbat of the convert who wanted to convert to Judaism while standing on one leg? Do you remember that? He went to Shammai's house. Shammai said, "Get out of here." Went to Hillel's house. Hill said, "I'm prepared to convert you, teach you all of the Torah while standing on your one leg." Do you remember that story? So the convert goes to Hillel, says, "Okay, I'll tell you all of the Torah while standing on one leg." And what does he tell the convert who's standing on one leg? He says, "What's hateful unto you, don't do your neighbor." And then he says to him, "That's the essence. Now go learn the rest." What, you don't think Hillel knew any of the mitzvot bein Adam l'makom, between man and God? Of course he did. But he felt that if you actually genuinely, authentically, and honestly consider the mitzvot of bein Adam l'chavero, if you believe in the mitzvot of human interaction, if you believe in the creation, then certainly you're going to come to want to honor, respect, and have reverence for the Creator. We are the creations. If treating a creation respectfully matters, then treating the Creator certainly will too. And Hillel believed that he would ultimately come to appreciate the bein Adam l'makom. But the Chachamim said, no, you need both. You can't just have one. If you have only one, then you have a faulty vision of what Judaism is. We need to walk strongly on both. And what is it, by the way? Do you remember what the angel said to Yaakov when he said, "I'm changing your name from Yaakov to Yisrael"? Do you remember what he said to him? Because you have striven im anelkim ve'anashim v'tuchal. What is that about? Like, why was the angel making this connection, as it were, to that, and Rabbi Yosef Salon says that's exactly the point. The angel was telling him, you need to do both. You need to be able to strive being Adam l'makom, and you need to strive being Adam l'chavero, and you need to create the balance. But you can, vatuchal, we can do that. We can create the balance. We can create the commitment. We can create the understanding that both pillars are necessary in order to walk in a balanced way. And so when we take a look at the story and we understand what it's about, it's not simply about Yaakov and an angel and laws of kashrut and what we can eat, what we can't eat. This is really much more fundamental. According to the Be'er Yosef, this is somehow a parable for how we create balance in our lives, right and left. The proverbial vision of what right and left is connected to that iconic vision of a right and left side of the Aseret HaDibrot, Bein Adam L'Makom and Bein Adam L'Chaviro. A completely different interpretation of the story than I think probably most of us have heard. I want to go on a little bit more. Oh boy, isn't it? Yeah, to move on to Perek Lamed Gimel, chapter 33. So Yaakov and Esav meet, and what happens. There's a reconciliation. Nobody gets killed. Nobody's fighting. Nobody's hurting each other, and they depart what seems to be in good terms. And Yaakov continues his journey back home. And as we enter chapter 33, we reach Pasuk 18. Yaakov nasa Sukkota, vayiben lo bayit. No. V'lemikneu asa Sukkot, al kein kara Hashem makom Sukkot. Yaakov sojourned to a place called Sukkot. He built himself a house and he made shelters for his livestock. And Yaakov arrived intact at the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, upon his arriving from Padan Aram, and he encamped before the city. He encamped before the city. Okay, so there's a lot of detail here, but when we talk about where Yaakov chose to stop his journey, he stopped his journey not in the city. He reached the city, but he encamped just outside of the city. And that detail is a detail that attracted a lot of attention of commentaries throughout the ages, meaning that Yaakov's decision not to enter the city but to stay outside of it needs a little bit of understanding. So it says Vayichan et pnei ha'ir, from the word Vayichan, meaning from the word machaneh. Here you have to understand, you have to hear the words of the Midrash. Fascinating. The Midrash explains that what's happening here is the following: that Yaakov is creating, as it were, a domain for his camp. There's the city and its domain, but Yaakov chooses not to enter that domain. He creates his own domain. The Hebrew word for that would be tchum. He creates a boundary. Here's my camp and its boundary, and there's the city and its boundary. And in fact, the Midrash says that Yaakov, as it were, was approaching the city. He was getting close to Shabbat. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the Shiur, our Avot intuited so many of the mitzvot of the Torah. When it came to Shabbat, he realized he needed to stop to make camp before Shabbat began. So he encamped and he made the tchum, the boundary, said, this is our boundary for Shabbat, and we don't cross our boundary. One of the great commentaries of the Torah, Meir Simcha Kohen of Dvinsk, known by the name of the commentary that he authored called the Meshech Chochmah, is intrigued. And he says the following, and it's such an interesting idea. He says this: there is a tradition that the Gemara says that our Avot, as we said at the beginning, kept all the mitzvot. Okay? Beginning with the first of the Avot. So Avraham also kept the mitzvot. So if Avraham kept all the mitzvot, including the laws of Shabbat, then presumably, Avraham also observed the notion of a boundary of Shabbat. There's a certain boundary that we don't cross on Shabbat. You can go for a walk, but you can't cross beyond this boundary. Going beyond this boundary is considered as though you're doing something on Shabbat you shouldn't be doing. Shabbat is a day of rest. You're going beyond the level of what we would consider to be appropriate rest. You can go for a walk, but going beyond this is not a restful walk. This is more than you need to do. So if that's the case, if Avram Avinu kept Shabbat, why is this notion of establishing this domain called Tchum, the boundary for Shabbat, why did it become associated with Yaakov and not with Avraham? Now, again, you have to understand that the rabbinic mind is looking at our Avot as having intuited so much about the mitzvot of the Torah. But in having done that, the Chachamim are willing to ascribe the notion of this mitzvah to Yaakov and never raise it in ascribing it to Avraham. But why is that? And here you have a fascinating distinction between a grandfather and a grandson, and maybe how times change. So if you had to describe what Avraham was like, Avraham, as we talked about another time, he's a kiruv worker. His idea was spreading the word of God. Avraham that's how outward projection. Avraham is about not creating the boundaries. Avraham is about exceeding or going beyond the boundaries. Because otherwise, how do you get to make the connections that you can? How will you get people to hear the messages if you create those boundaries? Avraham was the man who traveled. Avraham was the man who made souls. Avraham was the man who taught Torah. And in fact, it's the beginning of Reshit, when he Parsha Lech Lecha, many of these people traveled with him and wanted to listen from him. So why did Avram feel it was so important to spread the word of God? So the simple answer is that the more people who know about Hashem, the better. Nonetheless, we see that this was something Avraham specifically amongst the Avot was involved in. But why? So the Meshech Chochma, Rav Meir Simcha of Devinsk, says the following. The mandate of the nation of Israel is to serve as a setting. As a setting for what? As a setting for God's presence. The divine presence can reside. That's our job. Our job as a Jewish people is to create that environment in the world in which we bring God down to earth. That's our job. We do that through what we teach, who we are, the examples we say, the lessons we teach, the things we protest, the messages we share. That's what we do. And Avraham understood that this function could only be achieved by a community and not by an individual. If you want to bring God's presence to the world, then you have to create that presence by going out to the community. I can't be the only person who creates that presence. And that's why Avraham spent so much of his life trying to create that. But within 2 generations, the situation changed completely. Yaakov had emerged after 2 generations as the forefather, all of whose children were part of Hashem's program, and from whom the future house of Israel could be built. That's not the case with Abraham. He had Yitzhak, but he had Ishmael. Yitzhak had Yaakov, but he also had Esau. Yaakov had 12 children, 12 sons and a daughter, and all of them were committed equally to the image, to the message, to the spiritual presence that God wanted to create in the world. So there was no longer the need to emphasize bringing others in. Avraham had nobody else, but Yaakov did. He had a family unit with strong, capable sons and grandsons, and he felt that they could be the ones to accomplish this. Yaakov's focus now became on protecting his family from the outside influences. So therefore, when Yaakov went down with his entire family to Egypt, you remember, not here, but later on, he says, I don't want to live amongst the Egyptians. I want it to be in a ghetto. We're creating a ghetto where we'll be able to start our yeshivas and start our schools and maintain our culture. I don't want to be open to any forces of assimilation. That was Yaakov's concern. It was not Avram's concern. Avram thought that in order to do what he needed to do to bring the divine presence down, he had to spread. Yaakov's vision was he didn't need to spread. What did he need? He needed boundaries. And so therefore, it's not surprising that when it came to the notion of boundary, to whom, that was associated with Yaakov, because that was much more in keeping with who Yaakov was than it was keeping with who Abraham was. And you think about it. So where are we in our trajectory of Jewish life? Are we living in the Abraham era, or do you think we're living in the Yaakov era of boundaries? I don't know. From what I can see, I think it's more we're circling the wagons around, because I think we feel that whereas Abraham might have been having impact at his time, I think it's changed. Not that we don't have impact, or not that we have to stop, but maybe we're more in the Yaakov era of the world. Maybe there'll be another time we go back to the Avram era of the world. But this idea of why Yaakov stopped before the city was not a simple logistical question of, oh, you know what? I think we have more grazing field for animals. It was a calculated measure in order to protect his family and to, again, to establish boundaries. We didn't cover everything I was hoping to cover, certainly in this Parsha. I am going to stop. Let's unmute ourselves. Thank you, everybody. It was quiet during the Shiur, at least from what I was hearing. So I really appreciate that. Let's take a pause. And if anybody has questions or comments or observations, I would very, very much like to hear what you have to say.
Your Dvar Torah was absolutely wonderful.
Oh, Charlie, that's amazing. That's the best way to start a comment. That's amazing. Thank you. Can we be friends, Charlie? Okay, we are friends.
I'm interested.
I appreciate you saying that very much.
Can you hear me? It's Robin.
Yes, I can.
Okay. I'm interested in this idea of boundaries versus sort of this open tent approach. And I'm wondering
I don't know.
if there's room for both, or if they coexist and they can live together. Does that have to be an either or? Or do we have to be living in an either or time? It just seems like Judaism itself imposes boundaries as part of its essence and as what it demands of us as Jews, which isn't just because we have to be insular because we're under threat, but also because there are clear boundaries that need to be drawn in order for us to retain our identity.
So that's a good question. I'm happy to. I mean, I to some extent probably there can be coexistence, but to me the idea is that eras often have qualities that bring out responses that are different than other times. I'm not sure I'm saying it the way I want to.
Mm-hmm.
Like sometimes there's an arc to life or history, and there are these waves up and down, up and down, up and down, that there are times where things seem to be more important to groups and less important.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't exactly know what determines that. You're right that there's sort of like a baseline, here are the mitzvot that we do, but you know what? There have always been mitzvot that the Jewish people have been much more careful about, and mitzvot that they haven't. And that's why the Chachamim came up with the idea, even a mitzvah needs muzzle. Why? Because sometimes, through the course of history in our lives, certain mitzvot just don't get as much attention. I'll tell you here, I don't know if this is what you're referring to specifically, but give an idea about this sort of waves of things. So I worked, as you know, in a school for a very, very, very long time. So as I remember the early years, we were really very careful how to teach the kids how to say Birkat Hamazon, benching. So we want to teach the kids how to bench. That's a valid goal. But it became more and more difficult to teach the kids benching as diet changed. Fewer and fewer kids brought sandwiches to eat. And so everybody's having salads and other stuff. So if you're having a salad, you don't bench. So now how do you teach benching to kids who are not eating bread? So the mitzvah of Birkat Hamazon, in my opinion, is getting really just relegated to maybe 1 or 2 meals a week, and it's on a Shabbos. But 6 days a week, nobody's going to bench. So And why? Not because benching is important, but other factors have changed the way this mitzvah gets engaged. So I don't know whether it's absolutely exclusive. You're right, Robin, in saying that there are certain aspects of Jewish life, many which are mandated by halacha, which seek to create barriers. No question, like kashrut and other laws which were intended specifically to limit the interaction between Jews and non-Jews. No question about it. But on the other hand, you have stories in the Torah in which our avot are looking to create alliances between non-Jews. So for me, I'm trying to balance the two. Like Abraham had an alliance with a non-Jew. He realized that they needed that. So when I read that story, I try to say, where are my allies and how do we bridge that gap and still maintain the distance? And so it's not easy. I think that those are some of the challenges we face in the modern world. It's a powerful question. I don't know if I have a great answer.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
would you care to comment on the role of dreams in Jewish tradition? The role of dreams
Dreams.
in Jewish tradition? Because
Well,
we keep meeting dreams all along the way here, and they seem so significant. It's that just how important are they?
well, if you're reading Sefer Breshit, it's very clear that they play a role. There's no question. I mean, think about it. Actually, the very first dream that's mentioned is not the dream of a Jew. It's a dream of the king of Egypt when he took Sarah, unbeknownst to him of all the circumstances. But then dreams become really important and they become a vehicle by which God shares some his messages. I actually think that there's still a vehicle to this day. I don't think all of us are merit having some of those dreams, but I'm sure, Ralph, you have heard stories of this day of somebody having a dream that that somehow had a message, and this message was absolutely important. So I don't, in fact, halachically, if a person has a bad dream that's unsettling, there's a special tefillah that you recite. It's called Hatavat Kalamot. It's a prayer asking God to sort of, if this dream contains any evil portent or negative portent, please God, change it. And by the way, I don't know if you know this. Do you know on how holidays we have duchening birkat kohanim on the Yom Tovs, right? And the kohanim go up, and after they say the bracha, there's this melody that they all sing. Do you know what I'm talking about? Ah, da, 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 da. Do you know why they do that? You know why they sing the melody?
There's a there's a prayer in there for dreams.
Exactly. The melody is not the key. The melody is a time consumer. The melody is intended to take time, for which if anybody had a bad dream, he recites that dream between the two blessings. So it plays itself out. Ralph, in our lives. And I don't know anybody who sort of poo-poos dreams as just being foolishness. You can't read Sefer Breshit. You can't read Sefer Breshit and think the dreams are of no significance. I can't tell you that every dream is a prophetic insight, but I've heard stories, and you've heard stories of people who have had dreams, and the dreams have
powerful significance.
Yeah, they changed their life. Like there was a message, and the person heeded the message, and things happened. Yeah, so I think we need to take them more seriously than just casual child's play. Some of them maybe, but not all of them. Not all.
Fair to say that this is the way God communicates?
Yes, it definitely. It may be 100%. It's not a prophecy per se, but it may be a form of divine communication. That, yeah, I would believe that. Anything else? There's so much more in the Parsha that obviously we couldn't get to, but hopefully you'll continue doing some learning on your own and on Shabbat as well. So a reminder, everybody, that next Tuesday, which is December 9th, There will be no class, but in Yirtzeh Hashem, the week after, December 16th, we will be back, God willing. God willing.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you,
Rabbi
everybody.
Diamond.
Thank you. Have a blessed week, a week of bracha, a week of simcha, a week of Yeshua. And as I said at the beginning, may the bodies of the two remaining hostages be returned to Kever Yisrael, giving these families the peace of mind that they deserve, that they need, and for all of Jews everywhere. Thank you, everybody. All the best.
Rabbi.
Thank
Co-op.
you.
Thank you for
So
joining
much
me.
for
Thank
everything.
you.
Diamond.
Thank
Thanks a
you,
lot.
Rabbi
Thank you.
Diamond.
Have a good
Thank
week.
you,
Thank you
Ruth. Thank
for
you.
do what you do.